This morning while biking, I was listening to Lex Fridman's interview of Grimes. It was a really interesting conversation, and I had a lot of thoughts about it, but as per usual, while I'm out biking, I went off on my own tangent, and I started thinking about creativity and robots and AI, and whether it's going to be required that robots will be creative in order to function in society, and then even what the heck creativity is. Let's think about that for a minute. And for those of you interested in investing, check out WeBull, an amazing platform for buying and selling stocks, and now cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Dogecoin, and others. Open an account and get a free stock valued at up to $200, and fund your account and get another free stock valued at up to $1,600. Check out the link in the description and help the channel at the same time. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. So yes, I highly recommend the Lex Fridman interview with Grimes. She's a really interesting, intriguing person. I hate to admit this, probably just because I'm old, but but I didn't really know about her music much before I knew about her relationship with Elon Musk. So that be as it may, I'm happy to get to know her as an individual, both as an artist, and her music is rather interesting, even though she says she's semi-retired from music composition now. But also it's really fascinating to hear her talk as a person and talk about the different aspects of creativity. I think actually the two of us have a lot of the same thoughts. It was interesting listening to it because I was like, oh gosh, to be that young again. And I don't mean this in a negative way at all. I mean that I've had a lot of these thoughts for 20 or 30 plus years. You know, it's just been stuff that's milling around in my brain for that length of time. And even cool thoughts kind of tend to get, I don't know, they get old after a while. You know, you keep recycling the same things over and over again, and you're like, oh yeah, I've had that thought before. Oh yeah, I've had that thought before. So, you know, the ideas of protopia and utopia and futurism and technocracy, and I think she calls them homo techno for human beings that are sort of augmented by our computers. So, you know, a lot of these things are things that I've thought about, and also just music production and everything. I used to actually produce music on my own when I was in college. Like, I engineered the stuff. I composed it and engineered it back in the day when you actually used to have to render music. I know everyone these days is like, what the hell are you talking about? But I honestly, like back in the 80s, you would have to tell it to do something. You'd use a program like C-Sound or something, and you would have to actually implement that and tell it to go and render, and then you would go home and you'd get dinner or go to sleep and come back the next morning. It was a really crazy thing. It was a very different world. But anyway, I was composing and engineering music back at that time, like nearly 40 years ago now. So it was just interesting hearing her take on all of this stuff. And, you know, the fact that she's a full generation younger than me means that she's thinking about these things, but it still is kind of fresh in her mind as opposed to older. So maybe Elon's right. Maybe we can't change our minds. We can't continue to grow forever. And it's just best we die and get out of the way for the next generation. So yeah, that's a kind of unoptimistic way of starting this conversation. But what I really want to focus on here is how AI is changing right now before our very eyes. So since AI was created, AI was storage and search and some clever algorithms. That's pretty much what it has been. So the really classic AI from like the 50s and 60s and everything, when it would play checkers and it would beat a person at checkers, and it started to become decently good at chess, was a lot of clever human programming where humans would get in there and mix it up and change code and come up with, you know, clever search algorithms and things. AI is basically always just a giant search algorithm. It's always searching a search space and trying to find the best possible answer within that search space. It's just that the nature of that search has changed over time. So really classic AI used a lot of human intuition, a lot of logic to figure out how to search these spaces in efficient manners. More recently, of course, with neural networks and things like that, the searches have become sort of more just turn it loose on a whole bunch of data and let the AI figure out its own best search algorithm on its own. So there's kind of an interplay because humans still have to create the architecture, but then the neural networks actually do the figuring out and figure out how to optimize themselves. But really, no matter what kind of search the AI has been doing thus far, it's been going through and searching some sort of search space, some sort of data set, and looking for something. So things that we might think of as quasi-creative now, like our Alexa devices or Google, or even something like the full self-driving computer in a Tesla, those are mostly just going out and saying, like, given the text input, or given the vocal input, or given the driving input of like, I have to go here and I have to get over 2 lanes, what is the most optimal path to get to that point? That, in my mind, is not particularly creative. That's something that's just saying, I need to go from here to here, and what is the optimal way to get there? And yes, it can be a many-dimensional space that it's having to search, and it's really, really complicated. So I'm not taking anything away from AI in that ilk. I think, in fact, it's incredibly useful, and we human beings, we depend on it now. There's way too much stuff. There's way too much information that's out there for us to be able to efficiently retrieve it ourselves. I was thinking about this listening to the interview again. Grimes said that, 2 brains together is like x squared rather than x plus x. So it's like a squared relationship rather than an additive relationship. And I think what we've got is that effectively, and this was what sent me on the tangent, effectively what we've got in the form of something like Google or whatever is we've got the world's brains all put together. So we've got a kind of searchable space of much of human knowledge that we're able to access. So effectively what that does is it empowers our brains, right? So we go, instead of x squared, we're like x to the n or something, right? We're exponentially increasing our ability as human beings to be able to do something. And it was interesting because they were asking about like who did this and who did that, and they would pop out their phones and they would look at it and say like, oh, this is the answer, right? So we're kind of augmenting ourselves as humans, and that's one of the things that Grimes was talking about. But all of this augmentation puts human beings in the creative role. We have to ask the questions. We have to determine what's the right answer, et cetera, et cetera. The thing that's been really intriguing lately, and it kind of started with Google's Deep Dream, but lately OpenAI has sort of taken over with Dall-E and now Dall-E 2. And actually, I spent way too much time not actually filming this video because I was playing with some demos of the original Dall-E. Dall-E 2 is not really out yet. You can see the images, but you can't play with it yourself. But anyway, there's a couple of demo versions of Dall-E, the original one from just last year, which is just crazy. I'll put a link in the description if you're interested. And of course, I'm probably going to be showing, random outputs that I got while I was playing around with all of this stuff. And of course, my thumbnail this time is going to actually be one of these creative outputs of one of these AIs. So I think that's kind of a cool thing that we're actually starting to look at output that many people would consider to be creative, right? If you say, I want a dog in a spacesuit orbiting Mars or something, and it gives you that in the style of Van Gogh or whatever, right? So it can give you an oil painting sort of look of a dog in a spacesuit orbiting Mars. That's an impressive capability, and it starts to feel very much like that is creativity. That is something that's not merely information retrieval in a clever way or navigating a search space in a clever way, but it's creativity. But here's where I want to start to think about this. What really is creativity? I mean, when you say that, a lot of people are like, oh, it's the artist, right? They go off, they think about something and they're like, rah, and they like paint it or write it or do a video about it or something, right? You could say this is not particularly creative, but working on this video, I had to think of the idea, then I had to think of what I was going to say about it, then I had to ramble on for a long time to talk about it and film it and edit it and all that stuff. But that's kind of all downstream. The most important part was thinking about the original idea and kind of coming up with the shell of the concept of this. And people would generally say, okay, that's creative. It's not creative in the same vein as Leonardo da Vinci's, Mona Lisa. It's not the same amount of creativity as in building a crazy new building like a Geary or something like that. Those are things that are creative on a very, very high level, oftentimes with groups of people instead of with an individual, right? If you're designing a building, yeah, the creative impulse might be just by you, but in order to actually make it be buildable and have all the materials and all of the structural components and all that stuff, it's going to take a team of people. And of course, I work in a theater department, which is of course a very collaborative, generalized art sort of thing, right? You've got or at least traditionally, you've got a single writer that writes something, although that's kind of breaking down these days. But then you've got a director, you've got actors, you've got designers, you've got technicians, you've got a whole bunch of people who instantiate this. And of course, you can say the same thing about music. There is the capacity now for single individuals to compose and produce and execute the entirety of a musical composition, but that's only relatively recent. And certainly most of the time that's not the case, right? And you can of course take like classical situations like an orchestra or a choir where a composer writes something and then there's a conductor and there's a whole bunch of people who sing and play instruments. They interpret that and that becomes the artistic artifact that's going on. So all of these situations you're like, okay, so there's creativity going on all the time, but what does that actually mean? And the thing that started to intrigue me was I thought, okay, you've got something like OpenAI's Dall-E and Dall-E 2. That is creative, it seems to be creative, but really that is just an outgrowth of GPT. That's just an outgrowth of this pre-trained model that they then kind of repurpose into another output realm. And all that really is searching an enormous search space with a lot of parameters tuned. So what that means is that we've got something that we're considering creative, which is actually kind of along the lines of traditional AI, which is just a giant search space that we're searching. That then makes me think about we human beings. What are we doing when we're creating? Are we actually creating something, or are we simply searching a giant search space that kind of exists in our brains and we're kind of trolling through it around and around and around? And when we have what we think is a creative idea and then execute it, that really is us just digging through a search space, finding some things and going like, oh, that's kind of cool, and like bringing them out. I, of course, don't have a definite answer about this. Neuroscience, which I've taken some classes in, has some things to say about that, but creativity is one of those areas they stay away from a little bit, you know. I'm assuming that there are some fMRI studies of things where they say, envision to yourself a beach with snow on it and palm trees and then a rocket ship landing, right? So just something that's kind of out there where a person has to put together a whole bunch of different things. But even that is not ultimately creative, because what you're doing is you're already giving the person the creative prompt. You're telling them the thing that they need to create. What ultimately needs to happen is, in order for a test like this to be valuable, would be to say, you create something and tell me what it is and then watch the fMRI go. But even that really doesn't tell us that much. It just says which areas of the brain are active. But what is actually going on is a really interesting question. And something like Dall-E 2 and, Google's Deep Dream, all of those things make me start to really wonder. I've become very convinced over time that human beings are not nearly as special as we think we are. We actually think we are a lot more conscious than we actually are. We think that we have some sort of special prerogative over the world, and we have this sort of magic or voodoo that goes on that makes us who we are. I think that actually we are just an emergence property of complexity. And what we're seeing is finally that AI entities, AI agents like Dall-E 2 and things, are getting to the point where they're becoming complex enough that we're seeing emergent behavior coming out of it. And one of those emergent behaviors is things that we call creativity. Now, they're taking a text prompt and they're turning it into something else. So yes, there is a human being at the helm right now, and believe me, I played around with these demo things and they kind of suck. Obviously when you get a really good image and people are like, wow, that's amazing. And of course, these are third parties that reinstantiated Dall-E, and they're not the original. So, you can't judge it too much, but they're not as good as you might think. You can sort of cherry pick out really interesting examples, and my thumbnail will be one of those, which I think is really, really cool. But there's a lot of duds also. So I'm not saying that this is like superhuman level creativity at this point, because number one, it's not coming up with the prompt itself, and number two, it's failing sometimes. So there's a human being like me that's looking at this and scanning the results and going like, oh, I like that one. So, ultimately we're giving the beginning and the end of this process. It's just cool seeing the in between. But, this is 2022 now. 2021 was when the original Dall-E came out, which was significantly worse than the current version. And mid-2010s, like 2015, 2016, was when Deep Dream came out and had that first sort of, landscape with dog eyes or something like that. So we're really only talking about a half a decade or a little more since the beginning of this sort of creative output happened. So if you project forward to 2030, I don't really see a problem if we just keep complexifying these neural network models and coming up with better hardware to run it on, better algorithms to run it on, etc. I don't see why these things couldn't start to get to the point where they're creative at the level of humans. And that's something, people, I don't think we've talked about that much. A lot of people talk about AI super intelligence as being something where they're like way smarter than us at math, or they can solve rocket science and they can figure out a bunch of things like that. But what about the thing that makes us feel the most human, which is our creativity? What if we're just demonstrably worse than AI in 10 years at being creative? What does that do to us as human beings? What do we think about ourselves? And what does that say about our own individual creativity? And the other piece of this puzzle is, what about like Teslabot? What about embodied robots and full self-driving as well? Is there room for them to become creative as well? I'm personally very much of the camp that says that artificial general intelligence will have to be embodied, or at least we'll have to have that, right? It could have a central core someplace and is communicating with body parts out there, but I feel like if it's not actually interacting with the world in a physical way, it won't get to the point where we consider it artificial general intelligence. So I think it's really important, but what that means is that a full self-driving computer eventually could become a very creative driver, in the sense that like human beings, like a really, really good race car driver, you're like, wow, that person's really creative. The way that they take the turns and they adjust their paths based on the other people they're racing against, and how they really, really utilize the machine to the maximum, right? That would be considered creative racing. It's not just your bog standard driving where you just get up in the morning and you like yawn, drink your coffee and just, go to work. That's not very creative driving. So I could see the ability of full self-driving, of Tesla full self-driving and others, getting to the point where it's creative in its driving capability. And it'd be really cool to watch autonomous racing and see what differences there are between humans and autonomous racing, and whether you can put autonomous cars into human races. That's really pushing things to the max. So it'll be interesting to see how that works. And then of course we've got Teslabot, who is going to have to exist in a world of human beings. And that doesn't just mean being physically embodied, but it means dealing with humans, dealing with our emotions, dealing with our desires, not just in a very rudimentary sense, like when we're driving and we're all basically trying to do the same thing. But you get up in the morning and you're like, oh, I really, really need my coffee. And the robot knows that. But here you're dealing with humans on a much more nuanced level, and you're having to understand our desires and our needs over time, and as they change, and as sometimes we don't even know what our desires or needs are. So it makes it more complicated, but that does really open up the possibility of creativity, right? The robot can become creative, not just in understanding who we are, which is again, searching that multi-dimensional search space and trying to figure out what emotion the human being is displaying to me and what they really want, not what they're telling me they want. But it then opens up the door for the Teslabot to become creative in the sense of being able to compose music, or to paint a painting, or to build something, right? Or to go out and landscape. Gosh, I wish I had a Teslabot to do some landscaping right now. That would be awesome. But anyway, that sort of creativity is made possible by the embodiment of something like that. So I could definitely see something like a Teslabot becoming a very creative entity over time, as its algorithms and everything improves, and as the neural network training is better, and as the hardware it runs on becomes faster and more complex. So again, you've got that emergent property, but it's in an embodied state, so it's going to allow it to actually interact with the world and make things, and that would be really, really cool. So all in all, it's a really interesting thing to think about, and it's something that I hadn't really thought about AI and art a lot before I was listening to this interview, and it started making me think about I've thought a lot about what is creativity before, but I hadn't thought about what is AI creativity, and how super intelligent AI may actually be far better artists and far better creative thinkers than human beings are, in addition to being better than us at the kind of more traditional like STEM sort of fields that we think about. So it's a really fascinating thing to think about. I hope it's not depressing. I hope it's actually kind of like wow, if an AI can become like magnificently creative, it might be like living in a world where Mozart and Beethoven and Da Vinci and Jackson Pollock and just combine all of these amazing artists and more throw them all together into one entity, and it just creates these magical things that are just wow us. So it could actually be an amazingly good thing, not an amazingly bad thing, but it does make us human beings have to reconsider how smart we are and, what creativity is and our place in the universe. So whether it's in embodied space or disembodied space, I think that creativity in AI is definitely something that will be coming soon for us within 5 or 10 years, and it's going to be quite the revelation to us human beings how that all works. Anyway, I hope you find it a really interesting thought experiment as well, and we will have to wait and see what actually happens and how this all plays out. I, for one, am really fascinated to find out. All right, I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it fun and thought-provoking. There was definitely a lot of stuff to think about. If you did enjoy it, please do like it so other people can find it, and of course consider subscribing for more of this kind of content. As always, a huge shout out to my patrons on Patreon. Thank you all so much. In fact, it was my patrons on Patreon that recommended that I listen to the Lex Fridman interview with Grimes, so thank you. So again, in a sense, this video is due to you guys, so thank you all so much. And of course, if you want to join the team, just check out the link in the description. And if you're interested in a whole bunch of really cool merch, check out our merch store. Link is in the description. We have Teslabot t-shirts, the Tesla meme t-shirt, Success is a Possible Outcome, 4680 battery cells. All of that stuff is on t-shirts, mugs, tumblers, and on. So check it out. And for those of you interested in investing, check out WeBull, an amazing platform for buying and selling stocks, and now cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Dogecoin, and others. Open an account and get a free stock valued at up to $200, and fund your account and get another free stock valued at up to $1,600. Check out the link in the description and help the channel at the same time. Thank you. And finally, don't forget we are both Tesla and Amazon affiliates. If you look in the description, you can see how going shopping for a solar roof, a power wall, or anything on Amazon helps out the channel. In the meantime, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.